Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to do a deep dive on something I think we can all relate to,
Okay.
that love-hate relationship with caffeine.
Mm-hmm.
We're going deep on how it affects our blood pressure. Because let's be real, who hasn't felt their heart race after one too many cups of coffee?
Right.
You sent in a fascinating article from the MT Spot. Those folks really know their blood pressure stuff. And I've got our expert here to help us sift through it all, ready to dive in.
Absolutely. Let's unpack it.
Okay, so we know the basics. Caffeine is a stimulant. Stimulants can temporarily raise blood pressure, but I was surprised to learn that even though we see this effect all the time, scientists still haven't completely cracked the code on how caffeine does it.
It's true. It's like this big puzzle with a few pieces missing. We know caffeine interacts with our central nervous system and might even mess with certain hormones that control blood vessel width. But the exact mechanisms are still being researched.
Oh, so it's not just a simple case of caffeine monster running wild in our veins. There's more to the story.
Way more. And here's where it gets even more interesting. How our bodies react to caffeine is incredibly individual. Your genetics, how much caffeine you usually drink, even your overall health, they all play a part.
That makes total sense, but I never really thought about it that way. I mean, I know I turn into a nervous wreck if I have coffee afternoon. But my best friend can practically drink it with dinner and sleep like a baby. It's wild how different our responses can be.
Exactly, which is why blanket statements about caffeine and blood pressure can be tricky. It's not one size fits all.
So how do we make sense of all this? Well, the article does give us some hard numbers,
Yeah.
which I always appreciate, like that study they mentioned where having 2 to 4 cups of coffee led to an average increase of over 8 points for systolic blood pressure and almost 6 points for diastolic. Those aren't insignificant jumps.
Definitely not. And remember, those are just averages. For some people, the spike might be even higher, while others might barely notice a change. It all depends on how their body handles that caffeine.
Speaking of what we're putting into our bodies, the article runs through all the usual caffeine suspects. Coffee, of course, tea, sodas, even chocolate. Don't panic, chocolaters. We'll get to that in a bit. But first, let's tackle the big one, coffee. It's basically the poster child for caffeine, right?
Absolutely. And the article really digs into all the ways coffee can affect blood pressure. It's like a triple threat.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Lay it on me.
Now, first off, coffee blocks something called adenosine. Now, adenosine is like a chill-out signal for our brains. So when caffeine blocks it, we feel more alert and energized.
That explains the classic coffee pick-me-up, but there's more.
Oh, yeah. We're just getting started. Coffee can also constrict our blood vessels, which you can imagine can temporarily raise blood pressure. And if that wasn't enough, it triggers the release of adrenaline, our fight-or-flight hormone.
Whoa, triple whammy indeed. No wonder that morning cup makes us feel like we can conquer the world. But what about people who are practically married to their coffee maker? Surely they don't get the same jolt every time.
You're right. Regular coffee drinkers can build up a tolerance over time, meaning their bodies get used to the caffeine and don't react as strongly. It's like anything else. Our bodies are pretty amazing at adapting. Within reason, of course.
So maybe my daily cold brew isn't sending me into cardiovascular overdrive. That's a relief.
We'll have to see what the rest of the research says. But since you mentioned other beverages, let's switch gears from coffee to its slightly less jittery cousin tea. I have a feeling you'll find this interesting.
Okay, I'm ready for a tea break. Is it actually good for blood pressure? Spill the tea, as they say.
Well, tea generally gets a gold star when it comes to blood pressure.
Seriously, coffee who?
Right. It turns out tea has other compounds besides caffeine, things called flavonoids that are linked to heart health. In fact, one study found that drinking tea regularly could actually help lower blood pressure over time.
Okay, now I'm really considering joining Team Tea. But before I do, what about those supercharged energy drinks? They're like caffeine on steroids.
That's one way to put it. And while they might have fancy labels touting vitamins and whatnot, it's the caffeine and often other stimulants that we need to pay attention to.
Yeah, those things make me feel like I could run a marathon and then write a novel, and then maybe clean my entire house. But what does the research say about their effect on blood pressure?
Not great, to be honest. The article mentions a pretty alarming study from the American Heart Association. They found that drinking just 32 ounces of an energy drink in 1 hour led to some funky heart rhythms and a big spike in blood pressure that lasted for hours.
Yikes. Okay, I think I'll stick to my 1 cup of coffee, maybe dip my toes into the tea world, and steer clear of those energy drinks. But hold on. The article also mentions something called guarana. It's like super caffeinated, right?
It is. Guarana is a plant from South America, and it packs even more caffeine than coffee beans. It's often found in energy drinks and supplements for that extra jolt.
Wow, double the caffeine. That sounds intense. So is it even worse for blood pressure than coffee?
It's a bit more nuanced than that. While guarana, like any source of caffeine, can temporarily raise blood pressure, there was this fascinating study on indigenous populations in the Amazon. These folks regularly consume guarana as part of their traditional diet. We're talking serious caffeine intake here.
Okay, so these are basically the ultimate caffeine connoisseurs. What did the study find?
Get this, despite their high guarana intake, these populations had lower blood pressure rates than those who didn't consume it regularly. And it gets even wilder. They also had a lower prevalence of hypertension, obesity, and even metabolic syndrome.
Wait, what? So you're telling me there's a group of people out there who drink the equivalent of a triple espresso daily, and their blood pressure is lower than average? That's wild. What's their secret?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's important to remember that this study focused on a very specific population with a long history of guarana consumption. We need more research to understand how this applies to the general population. And if guarana has any long-term benefits, it's not as simple as saying everyone should start drinking guarana.
Fair enough. It's a good reminder that context is everything when we're talking about this stuff. Which brings us to the big question lurking in the background. Does regularly consuming caffeine actually cause high blood pressure in the long run?
That's what we all want to know, right?
Yeah.
And the truth is, the jury's still out, the research is ongoing, and it's a tricky thing to study.
I can imagine. There are so many factors to consider.
Exactly. Genetics, how our bodies individually react to caffeine. Even the design of the studies themselves can all affect the results. Some studies suggest a potential link between long-term caffeine intake and a higher risk of hypertension, while others haven't found a clear connection.
So it's a bit of a waiting game for more definitive answers.
For now, yes. But that doesn't mean we should just throw in the towel. If you're already at risk for high blood pressure, or if you're concerned about your caffeine intake, talking to your doctor is always a smart move. They can help you assess your individual risks and figure out the best plan for you.
Solid advice. In the meantime, what are some things we can do to keep our blood pressure in check? Besides maybe cutting back on the espresso, of course.
Well, the article does touch on a few things. Dr. Berg, a nutrition expert, suggests some caffeine alternatives that taste similar to coffee, but are caffeine-free, like Ticino and Roma. They're made from things like chicory root and carob.
Oh yeah, I've heard of those. I might have to give them a try.
They're worth exploring. But beyond caffeine swaps, it really comes down to a holistic approach. Those healthy habits we all know we should be better at.
Right, the usual suspects. Eating well, moving our bodies, managing stress, getting enough sleep.
Exactly. It's easy to get caught up in the specifics of caffeine. But ultimately, it's about taking care of our overall health. Caffeine is just one piece of the puzzle.
Well said. So we've covered a lot of ground today, from the intricate ways caffeine dances with our blood vessels to the lingering mystery of its long-term effects. But if there's one big takeaway from this caffeine deep dive, it's that our bodies are all unique snowflakes, and how we each respond to caffeine can be wildly different.
Couldn't have said it better myself. What works for one person might not work for another. And that's perfectly okay. We're all just trying to navigate this crazy thing called life. One cup of coffee or tea, or maybe even guarana at a time.
Love that. Big thanks to you as always for breaking it all down for us. This has been a fascinating deep dive.
My pleasure. I always enjoy our conversations.
It's like we've uncovered this whole secret world of caffeine, the science, the surprises, and the fact that we're all basically running our own personal caffeine experiments every day.
That's a great way to put it. And like any good experiment, it's all about observing the results and adjusting accordingly.
Exactly. So listeners, if you're feeling like your current caffeine routine isn't serving you well, maybe you're having those blood pressure spikes, or you're just feeling extra jittery, don't be afraid to switch things up.
Absolutely. Explore those alternatives, find what works for you, and most importantly, have that conversation with your doctor. They can help you navigate the ins and outs of caffeine based on your individual health history and risk factors.
Couldn't agree more. This deep dive has definitely given me a lot to think about, and I hope it's done the same for you. Remember, knowledge is power, especially when it comes to our health. A huge thank you to you for joining us on this caffeine adventure. It's always a pleasure picking your brain.
The feeling is mutual.
And to all of you amazing listeners out there, thanks for diving in with us. We'll catch you on the next episode of The Deep Dive. Stay curious, everyone.